All right, so 2027 is right around the corner, and if you're keeping up with global events like I know you are, especially with an eye on the UPSC exam, Taiwan is a big deal right now.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those hot button issues, a
Yeah.
lot of noise swirling around.
Definitely a lot of information out there, and a lot of it, frankly, is kind of confusing or maybe misses the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, we're going to try to cut through all that and really hone in on what's most important.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, particularly the one who suggested this topic for us, we want to get beyond just the headlines about China's military buildup.
Right, we want to go deeper.
Yeah, much deeper into their political and economic strategies. The things they're doing with regards to Taiwan that maybe aren't making the front page news, but are really crucial for understanding the whole situation.
Totally. And we got some really fascinating and really important information for you today. We're pulling from some really interesting sources.
Yeah, some really key stuff.
So we've got a declassified U.S. intelligence report to work with. This one's called Wealth and Corrupt Activities of the Leadership of the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, yeah, that's a juicy one.
It is. It is. And we're also going to be looking at some reporting from the Taipei Times.
So we're getting that Western perspective from the U.S. intelligence, but also that crucial on-the-ground viewpoint from Taiwan itself.
Exactly. And that combination gives us a really well-rounded, multifaceted view of what's happening right now.
Yeah, a much clearer picture than we'd get from just one side of the story.
Absolutely. And our mission here isn't just to, spit out facts and figures at you.
Right, we're not just reading from a textbook.
Not at all. Yeah. We want to go deeper than that. We want to look at the underlying motivations, what's driving China's actions, explore different potential scenarios.
What are the different ways this could play out?
Exactly. And really importantly, figure out what all of this means for the region, for the world, and of course for you, our listener, as you prepare for the UPSC exam.
Yeah, we want you to walk away from this with those key insights that are going to help you really nail your understanding of this complex issue.
All right, so to kick things off, let's look at something that might seem like it's just an internal matter within China, but it actually has huge implications for Taiwan.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It really is. We're talking about the military shakeup that Xi Jinping has been leading for over a decade now.
It's easy to get caught up in the headlines about the anti-corruption drive, which has been pretty massive.
5 million officials purged since 2012. That's a staggering number.
It's a huge number, but the real key here is that it's not just about corruption at its core, it's about control. Xi Jinping is consolidating power over the military.
And that includes going after some very senior figures, people who just a few years ago seemed completely untouchable.
Yeah, like General Li Shangfu, he was the defense minister just back in 2023.
And Admiral Miao Hua, who was in charge of the CMC's political work department.
Which is a really powerful position. It's basically the body that controls the political and ideological direction of the entire military.
And both of these guys, they were considered close to Xi, right?
Yeah, they were seen as his allies, but they still got taken down for what were officially called party discipline violations, which is often code for, not being quite on board with the big guy's agenda.
And this is where things get really interesting when we start connecting this to the Taiwan situation.
Yeah, it's not just an internal power struggle. It has major implications for China's foreign policy.
Exactly. And that declassified U.S. intelligence report really sheds light on this. It suggests that Xi is purging the military to make sure it's totally loyal and ready for action against Taiwan by 2027.
That 2027 date keeps coming up over and over.
It does, doesn't it? And the Taipei Times, in its reporting on this U.S. intelligence report, highlights a really startling claim from that report.
Oh, yeah, the one about corruption being rampant.
The report claims that a whopping 65% of Chinese government officials are involved in bribery or graft.
65%, that's more than half.
It's a huge number. And it even goes on to say that this culture of buying promotions has been a problem within the PLA itself.
Yeah, even in the military, people have been getting ahead, not based on merit, but by greasing palms and paying their way up the ladder.
And that obviously raises serious questions about the competence and the loyalty of the people in charge.
Exactly. Are these the best people for the job, or did they just buy their way in, and are they really going to follow orders, especially if those orders are to invade Taiwan?
And the report actually makes a direct link between this anti-corruption drive and the 2027 timeline for Taiwan.
Yeah, it specifically states that Xi Jinping's focus on stamping out corruption in the PLA, quote, may also reflect concerns that corrupt practices will prevent the military from acquiring the capabilities and readiness he has directed it to achieve by 2027 in preparation for a potential conflict over Taiwan, end quote.
So basically, Xi wants to make sure that the military is a well-oiled machine ready to go when he gives the order.
He needs to be sure that his orders are going to be followed without question. and that the people carrying them out are actually capable of doing the job.
And for you listening out there, this connection between internal control and external ambitions, that's a crucial takeaway for understanding China's overall strategy.
Absolutely a must-know for the UPSC.
So we've been talking about the potential for a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, and that's certainly something that's on everyone's minds, but it seems like China has other options that might be more readily available.
Yeah, there's a whole spectrum of possibilities, and one that's really worth paying attention to is the blockade strategy.
A blockade of Taiwan.
Exactly. Now, a full-on invasion that's incredibly complex, it would be a huge undertaking with a lot of potential problems.
Logistically speaking, it would be a nightmare.
But a blockade, well, that's something they seem to be much better prepared for.
And they've been actively practicing for it too, right?
Oh, yeah, they've been running drills simulating a blockade of Taiwan for a while now.
Like those massive air and naval drills they held back in October of 2023.
Those were huge. They had a record 125 military aircraft involved.
Wow, a huge show of force.
Definitely. They had everything from fighter jets to helicopters to drones all participating. And Taiwan's defense ministry, they interpreted that pretty clearly as a simulated blockade.
They saw it as a dry run for the real thing, practicing things like sea and land strikes and even closing off ports.
And while China officially called it a combat readiness exercise, it's hard not to see that as a pretty clear message to Taiwan and to the rest of the world.
We shut you down if we want to.
Exactly. And the thing is, they have the naval power to back that up.
China's Navy has been growing rapidly.
It's already the largest in the world in terms of the number of warships, over 370 right now.
Wow.
And it's only going to get bigger projections. Say they could have as many as 425 warships by 2030.
That's significantly more than the U.S. fleet.
Yeah, they're really outpacing the U.S. in terms of sheer numbers.
And while they're still behind the U.S. when it comes to aircraft carriers,
which are those really big, powerful ships that can launch lots of planes, the symbols of naval dominance.
yeah, knows.
China's catching up fast. They launched their second carrier back in 2019, and their third one is expected to be operational pretty soon.
So their ability to project power across the seas is growing rapidly.
And that's a major factor in their ability to pull off a blockade of Taiwan.
Definitely.
That.
But let's shift gears a bit here, because beyond these traditional military assets, there's another really crucial element of China's strategy towards Taiwan.
One that often gets overlooked.
And that's cyber warfare.
This is a huge one, and I think it's potentially the most potent weapon China has in its arsenal.
More potent than even their ships and planes.
Potentially, yes, because they've shown a real willingness to use it, and it can be incredibly disruptive.
And we've seen this pattern where almost every time China conducts a major military exercise near Taiwan, it's accompanied by cyber attacks.
They go hand in hand.
And those cyber attacks, they're targeting things like Taiwanese government systems.
Trying to disrupt their ability to function.
And critical communication networks.
Cutting off communication, sowing chaos.
And we saw a real-world example of how vulnerable Taiwan is to this back in 2024.
Oh yeah, the incident with the undersea internet cable.
Those cables got cut, and it caused major disruptions.
It shows how reliant we are on this kind of infrastructure and how easily it can be targeted.
And how devastating it can be when those connections are severed.
Absolutely. It's a wake-up call that the first shots in a conflict might not be fired from guns or missiles, but through keyboards.
So Taiwan is facing pressure on multiple fronts here, and this dependence on imports, that's another major vulnerability that China could exploit.
Yeah, they're really susceptible to economic pressure.
Taiwan relies on imports for a staggering 96% of its energy needs. It's oil, coal, natural gas, pretty much everything.
And imagine what would happen if China imposed a blockade. Those energy reserves would dwindle really quickly.
Blackouts would be almost inevitable.
Widespread blackouts, economic chaos. It would put immense pressure on the government to give in.
And it's not just energy either, right? Food security is a major concern as well.
Absolutely. Around 70% of Taiwan's food comes from abroad.
So a blockade could lead to severe shortages and hunger?
Exactly. It's a way for China to put the squeeze on Taiwan without even launching a full-scale invasion.
Create a situation where they're so desperate they're forced to negotiate or even surrender.
A siege, by other means.
And there's another option we haven't talked about yet that's perhaps less aggressive than a full-blown blockade, but still incredibly impactful.
The so-called quarantine.
What exactly would that look like?
Well, it's basically a way for China to exert control without resorting to a full military blockade.
Sort of hybrid approach.
Yeah, they could start by imposing strict inspections and regulations on ships heading to Taiwanese ports.
It's like really tight customs checks.
Yeah, and they might start with Kaohsiung, which is Taiwan's largest commercial harbor. Choke off their biggest port first.
And what would be the leverage there?
Yeah.
How would they force ships to comply?
Simple economics. China could just say, look, any shipping company that doesn't follow our quarantine rules is banned from doing business in China.
Oh, so they'd be cut off from the massive Chinese market.
Exactly. And that's a huge incentive for companies to comply.
Because China's such a big player in the global economy.
Yeah, they have a lot of leverage, so they could essentially create an economic stranglehold on Taiwan without firing a shot.
And it sounds like a lot of experts believe that China could actually do this right now if they wanted to.
Yeah, there's a pretty broad consensus on that. Bonnie Lin from CSIS, she's a well-respected analyst, and she said that there's general agreement that China could impose a quarantine or blockade on Taiwan today if they made that political decision.
So Taiwan is facing some very serious threats, but they're not completely defenseless, right? They do have their own military capabilities, and the geography of the Taiwan Strait itself is a major factor.
Yeah, it's definitely not going to be a walk in the park for China if they do decide to use force.
An amphibious invasion across the Taiwan Strait would be incredibly difficult for any military.
It's a really treacherous stretch of water, often rough seas, unpredictable weather, and there are only a limited number of suitable landing beaches.
And then once they're ashore, the terrain itself is challenging for an invader.
Yeah. Taiwan's got mountains, coastal cliffs, mudflats, densely populated urban areas along the coast. It's not an easy place to conquer.
It's a defender's paradise.
And then you've got Taiwan's own weaponry to consider, especially those advanced anti-ship missile systems.
A lot of those supplied by the U.S.
Yeah, they've got some really sophisticated systems that could pose a serious threat to any invading naval force.
So they're not just sitting ducks.
No, they're taking this threat very seriously, and they're actively preparing for it.
They've been running drills, simulating a Chinese attack.
They had a 5-day war game in March of 2025, and they're planning another even bigger exercise later this year that's specifically designed to test their defenses against a potential 2027 invasion.
So they're not just assuming it's not going to happen. They're actively preparing for the worst-case scenario.
And, of course, we can't talk about this without addressing the elephant in the room, the United States.
Right, the big question mark hanging over everything.
The U.S. has been Taiwan's main security guarantor for decades.
But their commitment to defending Taiwan has always been deliberately ambiguous.
It's this policy of strategic ambiguity. They haven't said outright that they would defend Taiwan, but they haven't ruled it out either.
It's a way to deter both China from attacking and Taiwan from declaring independence.
Yeah, keep everyone on their toes.
But things have gotten a lot more uncertain in recent years, especially during the Trump presidency.
Trump's foreign policy was, well, unpredictable, to say the least.
And his actions like suspending aid to Ukraine really raised doubts among U.S. allies about America's reliability.
Yeah, it made people wonder if the U.S. could really be counted on in a crisis.
And this uncertainty, it's playing right into China's hands.
It's emboldening them, making them think that maybe the U.S. won't intervene if they do decide to make a move on Taiwan.
And this is something that worries Taiwan a lot.
Huang Chengting from Taiwan's Institute for National Defense and Security Research. He put it really starkly. He said that Taiwan's worst nightmare isn't a Chinese invasion itself, but the prospect of American isolationism.
The U.S. just washing its hands of the whole thing.
Yeah, that's their biggest fear, being left alone to face China.
So as we get closer to this 2027 timeline that everyone keeps talking about,
Which is really just around the corner.
Are there any signs that China might be willing to pursue a diplomatic solution?
Or at least show some restraint.
Yeah. Are they really going to go through with this?
Oh, it's a complex picture, but there are some indications that they might be prioritizing other things right now.
Like what?
Well, their own economic growth, for one thing.
They've been trying to keep their economy humming along.
And maintaining a relatively stable relationship with the U.S.
Because a major confrontation over Taiwan would obviously jeopardize both of those things.
Yeah, it would be a huge shock to the global economy.
But we've also seen some pretty aggressive rhetoric coming from China, especially after Taiwan's recent presidential election.
Yeah, when Lai Ching-te, the new president, called China a foreign hostile force back in March.
It didn't go over well in Beijing.
No, they issued like 18 official statements in just 4 days condemning him.
Wow, that's a lot of statements.
And their state-controlled media went after him pretty hard, calling him a cornered dog and things like that.
So definitely not mincing words there.
But some analysts believe that despite the harsh language, China might be trying to avoid actually escalating things militarily.
Amanda Cowles and Ava Shen from the Eurasia Group. They've suggested that Beijing probably prefers to keep things relatively stable with the U.S., at least for now. So it's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah, they're trying to project strength without actually provoking a major crisis.
And there are still ongoing trade talks and the possibility of a future meeting between Xi Jinping and the U.S. president.
So the door to diplomacy isn't completely closed.
But the bottom line for Taiwan is that they can't just rely on diplomacy. They have to be prepared for the possibility that China's military exercises could turn into the real thing.
Yeah. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
All right, so to sum all this up for you, our listeners, especially those of you preparing for the UPSC exams,
This is the key stuff you need to know.
China's strategy towards Taiwan is incredibly complex. It's not just about military. They're using a multi-pronged approach.
They're consolidating control over their own military. They're leveraging their economic power, and they're not afraid to use cyber warfare.
And that 2027 date, it's not arbitrary. It's a target they've set for themselves to be ready for a potential conflict.
And the potential scenarios go way beyond just a full-scale invasion.
A blockade, a quarantine cyber attacks, all of these are possibilities.
And for you as a UPSC aspirant, understanding these nuances is absolutely essential.
You can't just focus on the military hardware. You have to grasp the political dynamics within China, the economic vulnerabilities of Taiwan, the strategic calculations of the U.S.
And all connect.
It really is. So as you continue your studies, we want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Something to really chew on.
What single factor do you think will ultimately be the most decisive in shaping the future of the Taiwan Strait?
Is it China's internal stability, Taiwan's economic resilience, the consistency of U.S. foreign policy?
It's a tough question, but it's one worth thinking about.
There's no easy answer.
We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this incredibly complex and important issue.
And that it's helped you in your UPSC preparation.
If you found it helpful, please do like and subscribe to our show.
And leave a comment below if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to explore in future deep dives.
And for further research on this topic, we encourage you to check out the Economic Times, which was one of our sources for today's episode.
They've got some great reporting on this issue.
Thanks for joining us.
Till next time.